I'm Tyler Spalding. I am with PayPal. I lead social innovation for the company globally, which is all of our social and environmental impact work around the world. So welcome. We have about 30 minutes for today's conversation. And I'm joined by Greg from Wells Fargo, Felix from the Urban Capital Network, and Tamira from Storehouse in a Box. I'll let them all introduce themselves as they tee up their comments. But I wanted to start with just a little bit of a couple of key data points that I think can help frame this conversation. And then we are also going to reserve about 10 minutes or so at the end for all of your questions or contributions that you'd like to share, because I know there's a lot of expertise in this room. Pew Research Center came out last week with what I found to be a shocking stat. 1 in 4 Black American households and 1 in 7 Hispanic American households have either no wealth or found themselves in debt in 2021. So there's a massive wealth gap challenge that still confronts this country. On the opportunity side, the World Economic Forum has reported that at least $500 billion could be added to the global economy if we were to address these challenges, if we were to improve economic and social mobility. So there's a challenge confronting our country today, and there's also massive economic opportunity. And so it's in that spirit that I'd love to kick off with Felix and ask you to perhaps set the context a little bit more for us, for this conversation. How should we understand the current state of economic and social mobility here in the U.S.?
Thank you, Tyler. Good morning, everyone. Again, Felix Chevalier with Urban Capital Network. Urban Capital Network is an investment management firm that focuses on investing within the venture capital space. We actually focus on this particular area because it's one of the few asset classes that communities of color do not invest in. And if we're going to be talking about closing the racial wealth gap, that means you got to create wealth in the communities that don't have the wealth. In order to create the wealth, you have to educate them and give them access to those opportunities. And so one of the things that we do is we bridge the two gaps, right? It's really three. One is just awareness, right? If you don't know, then there's no way you're going to do something that you don't know about. Secondly, once we give them awareness, then we educate them on how to do it. And then third, we provide the access. It doesn't matter if you know about something, if you can't access it, then it's pointless. And so what we do, and just give you some context to what I'm referring to, if you are looking to invest in the venture capital space, if you're not a UBS or some pension fund, and you happen to be a friend or family member who knows people in the venture capital firm, the typical investments is roughly about $250,000 to get in to the investment. Most of us do not have $250,000 to invest in a venture capital firm. So what we do is extend our access to these venture capital firms to our network of friends, colleagues, professionals, to be able to invest at a lower investment threshold so they can get a piece of it, and as their wealth continues to grow, they can obviously do more. In terms of the research, McKinsey did a study that showed that African Americans have 1/10 the wealth of whites, Latinos have 1/7 the wealth of whites, and that racial wealth gap is actually continuing to widen. But there are opportunities for us to help close that gap, and I'll talk more about that later.
So Greg, maybe I could hand over to you next. What are you seeing from one of the country's largest financial institutions? Who's getting ahead? Who's falling behind? And then maybe you could crack into a little bit of what is the solution space that you're starting to work on?
So hi, everybody. I'm Greg Morishiga with Wells Fargo, part of the Banking Inclusion Initiative. And within our work, there's a spectrum of different elements. We know from Federal Reserve data, the latest Federal Reserve data, that there are about 6 million households in this country that are unbanked, and about another 17 or 18 million that are underbanked. So you may have a bank account, but you still use alternative financial services providers from time to time. Looking further at the data, you can see that within the unbanked, they are disproportionately Black and African American, Hispanic households, Native American households, and so all of these segments are a particular area of focus for us in this work. Using our relationship with Operation Hope, we're able to have Hope Inside, and you heard this from Darlene Goins last night. We're able to have Hope Inside coaches in our branches to provide financial coaching, to provide financial education workshops. You know, we believe that financial inclusion is really the gateway for creating wealth. You need to have that foundation of a bank account in order to build investments, get a down payment for a home, to have that platform. So that's what we do.
Thank you. Tamira, I'm wondering if you can help us understand what works or what's changing when we think about access to economic opportunity. Of course, home ownership has always played an important role, but so too does community investment in education, so too does affordable access to credit, pathways to entrepreneurship. So how do you see the solution set?
So good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all today. Again, I am Tamira Chapman, founder and president of Storehouse in a Box, a global merchandising company. And when I hear the stats, I don't know that I'm calibrating the exact same way. So when I hear that African Americans have 1/10 of the wealth, that's telling me that we got 1/10 of the information. Because what I know about African Americans and brown communities is that we are hardworking and we are excellent every single time we attempt to do just about anything. So the only reason we don't have the wealth is because we haven't had the access to get into the VC fund. We didn't even know that VC funds exist. We didn't have the ability to go and enter the stock market because we simply didn't have access to those sort of folks that are inside of our communities. So when I think about the things that are inside of the Black and brown communities, it simply isn't set up for us to be successful in that way. So the reason why I love opportunities like this one is because we're in a room, we're in a space, and yes, we can take back to some of our family or to our neighbors that they need to be banked, that they need to develop a credit score. But for those of you that are here, my assumption is that that's preaching to the choir. You all have all those things. So the next level is, what else do I need to do in order to become, part of the other 80 or 90% that's sitting on all of the wealth? From my perspective, that's entrepreneurship. So my background is in law, and so I went to law school, and I thought that would simply be it. But that first dream was really only big enough for me, because when we think about Black and brown folks doing things like becoming lawyers, becoming doctors, that's great, but we have a 400-year gap that we need to close, and it's gonna be impossible to do with just one career. So when I think about entrepreneurship, that dream was actually one that's big enough for my family. That one's big enough for a community. That one's big enough for multiple generations. And what I love about entrepreneurship is, especially in this time and place, you can really go out in this world and do whatever it is you want to do. So my particular business is in e-com. Folks don't know if I'm black, white, brown, or purple. If I have a product that you have an interest in, your dollar is green and you're willing to purchase that from me. And because that's the case, that's the space that we're in. And I'll kind of just close off this comment by saying, we don't know how long it'll take for us to arrive at other optimal circumstances like the ones that we have today, right? And so when we think about it, we have, our next generation of children and grandchildren coming behind us. Laws could be repealed, things could change. So while we're sitting in this moment and you look around at the things that we have the ability to do, my suggestion is that we go ahead and we take advantage of that. And what we know from Black women is that they're absolutely doing it, because we've got more startups than anybody else in America at the moment. So we're getting at it. We just need partners like a Wells Fargo, like a PayPal, and you both are doing your job. So thank you for that, to just help us scale these businesses.
So Felix, maybe I could hand off to you to talk about this a little bit. Like Tamira touched on, these communities are amongst the most entrepreneurial and the most resilient. So how do we not only support more Tamiras across the country, but also enable more of them to scale and achieve all of the things that Tamira just outlined?
Okay.
Small question.
So I'm going to take a step back, because there's a tremendous discussion around entrepreneurship, particularly in our community. If you look at any economic ecosystem anywhere in the world, there are certain key components to it. You have your innovators, the people who create a product or a service. You have your investors. You have the workforce, and you have the consumers of the product or the service. In our community, we have, as Tamara just mentioned, entrepreneurs in spades. We certainly have been the workforce. We have no issue with being being the innovators. Oftentimes, the entrepreneurs are the innovators. But in our community, what we lack in that ecosystem are the investors to invest in those entrepreneurs. So we can actually have more of hers in our community, but there's a reason why we don't have more. And there's a reason why so few of the entrepreneurs in our community are not really entrepreneurs, they're self-employed. And there's a big difference between being a business owner and being self-employed. We are more self-employed, and we use the phrase entrepreneur, but you're really just self-employed. I know that because I'm talking about myself as well. And if you think, we were talking about this earlier, we were talking about Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad Poor Dad. He has another book called The E Quadrant, how you go from, you should start as an employee, then you go self-employed, then you become an investor, then you become a business, and then you become an investor. Investors being the goal, to create wealth. So what we have to do, if we really want to close the racial wealth gap, we got to build wealth in our community. To build wealth in our community, we have to create investors, because everything is not purely, everyone in our community can't be the entrepreneur. You can't have an ecosystem of just entrepreneurs, because that is not an ecosystem, right? It's like saying, you have a pot of water and you want to create an ecosystem. Well, if you just have water and you don't have the animals and you don't have algae for them to eat and other pieces of the ecosystem, then you don't have an ecosystem. So we over-index, I believe, on entrepreneurship. Give you a live example. And this is what people tend to miss, and this is what we missed. When the George Floyd incident occurred, corporations, foundations, high net worth individuals, and other organizations flooded money to entrepreneurs. And our entrepreneurs need the money. The problem is that actually increases the racial wealth gap. That sounds counterintuitive. How is it that if you're giving money to entrepreneurs in our community that we hope all become successful, how does that increase the racial wealth gap? Here's how. If you take anybody in this room and you become, what's your name, young lady? What's your name? Leah? Where are you from, Leah? Dallas. You're from Dallas, Texas. Dallas or Fort Worth, which one? She's in Dallas. Oak Cliff? No? All right. So Lisa, what's your name one more time? Leah. So let's say Leah decides she wants to create a business, and because her family only has 1/10 of the wealth as others, she can't go to her friends and family, which is the first line of funding for most entrepreneurs. She can't go to the angel network, right? So what happens? People hear that she needs money, and outside money, white money, goes to build her business. Her business becomes incredibly successful. She becomes a unicorn. In the venture capital world, that means she has her company is now worth $1 billion. She either, someone buys her company or she goes public. She is fantastic at her business. She's done well. She and her family are going to do exceptionally well. She's going to own roughly, by this point, here's the kicker. She's going to own about 12 to 15% of that company, which means she's going to enjoy $120, $150 million. Life is fantastic for her. But that other $850 million went where? To the investors. So do you see, if you keep perpetuating that cycle, the very people who cultivated the genius in her, who got her to get to the point that she's in today, are the very people who don't get to participate in the wealth generation that her idea created. So this is why we have to be very intentional about creating an investor class.
Can I add something to that? And I see the blink to the left. So I'll just say this. I agree that it's nice when we have access to outside capital, especially when it makes sense from a business perspective, right? We're not giving away the farm. But I'll also say that there's a lot of wealth in Black and brown communities. So we don't need everybody else's money if we simply decide to support one another. So if we're intentional about what we're buying and what we're spending on, so if you have a family member, if you have a friend, and you know that they're excellent at baking cakes, this Christmas, instead of buying them something that they really don't want, just decide to help them invest in an LLC, help them get a trademark, help them, figure out how to get work inside of a commercial kitchen. And before you know it, we can get them distribution at Walmart. We can get them distribution at Target. We can get them distribution at Meijer. So you never know what these businesses really have the ability to become. And in terms of building a business, we don't need the people that went to Harvard. They didn't have to go to Stanford. Your daughter, your mother, your grandmother, your brother, like these people are smart enough to help you build the next unicorn. It is ordinary people that come together that end up making extraordinary things happen. And so let's not buy into we don't have the money. We do have some money. So everybody may not have some, but if we do what we're used to doing over the last couple hundred years and bring our little bit to the table, then we can do extraordinary things. And if we bring our talents to the table to help one another, we may not be able to solve all of the world's problems, but we'll put a dent in it. And when people see us helping ourselves, then other people tend to come and join that.
I think that this is an extraordinarily important point around the importance of supporting and uplifting and advancing community-based organizations and institutions. At PayPal, following the murder of George Floyd, we established a $538 million initiative, all of which has been deployed. $500 million of which $500 million of which was investments into local CDFIs and MDIs. So I'm curious, maybe Greg, could I hand over to you, and I'm curious if you could pull on this thread of what we can do, what more we can do to support community-based organizations and institutions, build trust, upgrade them for the digital economy, and also what opportunity there is for additional and greater public-private cooperation to do so.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay, all right, so
We're packing a lot in a short amount of time.
Let's try one part of that. One thing that I love about this event is being able to meet people. And you see the spectrum of folks that come to the Hope Global Forums, different parts of the country, different backgrounds. And everyone, if you are here, you are committed to this work. You care about this work. You care about your communities, the people that we are fortunate enough to serve. And last night, I was lucky enough to be chatting with folks, and I was blown away by their stories. Elevating the stories of the work that is being done by your individual organizations is key. Because, one, it allows for creating visibility of the work that's being done. One is Good Dirt here. There was somebody from Good Dirt that, okay, thank you, sir. So I was chatting with you last night, and hearing the story about the work that Good Dirt is doing with affordable housing, helping the spectrum of different folks that are difficult to house, formerly, or the returning citizens and the formerly homeless. Telling the story of the work that you all are doing and elevating that can help to inspire others to follow that lead, and also, the part two of this, to hopefully generate more capital and opportunities for organizations like you. So I think that by elevating these stories, it's not for the purpose of patting oneself on the back, profiting from it. It's to be able to inspire folks to see that if you are a returning citizen, or if you're a new immigrant, or if you are in need, I can see myself in that story and be able to come to an organization like that. And then I think that also helps to fuel resources, dollars coming into communities of color and fueling initiatives exactly like that.
So we'll take a few questions in just a minute. I'll ask my last one while you think about what you want to ask. Tamira, maybe you could pick up on this thread of what role do you see different institutions, public, private, social, having to play going forward?
I just need for big institutions to read the data. And so if big institutions read the data, we know that by 2050, we're female and we're brown. And so I think for our particular communities, we don't need a handout. We simply, you need to understand who your customers are getting ready to be over the next couple of decades. And if it's important to you to stay in business and be around, start trying to figure out how to serve that audience today. And by serving us, they're really serving themselves.
Absolutely. There's a question, yep, right there.
Hi, my name is Montina Young-Frazier, and I'm a business advisor at the Russell Innovation Center for Entrepreneurs. And yay, thank you for your support with our organization. So I really like what Mr. Felix said about we're over-indexed with entrepreneurship. And I also like what Tamira's talking about with supporting our communities. But within the Black community, we seem to have an overabundance of either service-based and or candle makers or restaurants or shea butters, instead of focusing on the more traditional businesses where we can gain access to opportunities in the government, federal, private sector spaces. I'd like to hear you talk more about that conversation, because if there are people that are in that construction space, they can gain access to $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, $10 million opportunities versus us for Christmas or holidays buying cake from each other. You have to sell a lot of cakes to build up within our neighborhoods. The second thing is we don't have access a lot of times in the American descendant of slavery community to send money back home. So when we're trying to circulate dollars in our community, again, it's more difficult. So I'd like to hear some feedback on Black entrepreneurs starting traditional businesses where we can gain access to larger opportunities. Thank you.
So I'll just say that all things are local, right? So I think that in this country, the first thing that we need to do is democratize problems. So people solve the problems where they live. And so in terms of understanding how do we get people into other industries, they have to be aware of what's even out there. So what does it look like to start a construction company? So we have people that are candle making, that are baking cakes, because those are the sorts of needs that they're seeing in the community. So exposure has a tremendous deal. Exposure is playing a huge role in that. The second part is, I agree, you do have to sell a lot of cakes, but we eat a lot of cakes. So I would just say, as it relates to our businesses, I don't think any one is more important than the other. I think that there's room and space for them all. And if we do them the right way, they do have the ability to scale and be something that could change the trajectory of a community. So that's my general thoughts on that. And exposure is the other key piece of it to me. And Felix, I don't know if you want to.
So we're talking about building wealth, and you're right. Selling certain products are just not designed or just inherently won't get us there, right? That's not a knock against it, right? Growing up, I grew up in a house where in our second bedroom, my mother did hair, right? So I understand you got to do what's relevant within the community. I completely get that. So you said you were at the H.J. Russell Business Advisor them. Yeah, so we just hosted Urban Capital Network along with our nonprofit, the Innovation Center for Urban Entrepreneurship, hosted 50 African-American men at the White House to talk about economic advancement. And this was by request, because I get the question from women, well, why weren't women there? There was a request at the White House. You could take it up with Biden and Kamala Harris. And Jay Bailey with your organization was actually one of our key speakers. And he kind of echoed some of the things that you talked about. The federal government just announced that they're going to be creating regional technology hubs all across the country. Many of you probably live in the jurisdictions in which these regional technology hubs are going to be created. These technology hubs are, think about it in the context of the United States is looking to create 20 more Silicon Valleys across the country. And this is going to create the economy of the American future. And as we talked about earlier, we are going to be the American future. So we have to play a role in that process. And the purpose of that meeting at the White House was to talk about how we could be strategically aligned with where the federal government is putting their money, to make sure that we are included. When I say we, that's both Black, Latino, and underrepresented communities, to be a part of that ecosystem. Going right back to what I said actually at the beginning of my comments, which is making sure that we're filling the gap that we often do not participate in, and that is by investing in entrepreneurs in our communities who can actually provide products and services to these emerging economies that the federal government is putting money into. And if we don't do it, then all we're going to do is get more of the same of what happened in the past. Because it's coming, we know it's coming, the federal government's putting money into it, these opportunities are these technologies are gonna be created, whether we want them to be created or not. We have the innovation in our communities, right? Whether we realize it or not, whether it's the traffic light, whether it's the GPS system. I mean, we created all, early at the beginning, I made the comment that an ecosystem has different components to it, and the first one I mentioned was the innovators. We are innovators, but if our innovators do not have the money to do it, it becomes a problem. Last point on this. You're right, we do have the money in our community. I'm gonna tell you something that shocked us just a couple weeks ago. We had a meeting with JP Morgan Chase with the wealth management side, and the wealth management folks invited some other people from their team. One of the guys I actually already knew. And we're having a discussion, we're talking about how, in the African American community, we have over 500,000 people who are accredited investors, most of which do not know they're accredited investors. In the Latino community, we have 1.2 million accredited investors who don't, and many of them don't even know they're accredited investors. Now, there's no shame in not knowing, because again, like I said earlier, if you don't know, you just don't know, right? And what was fascinating is I can tell by the questions that were being asked that the two guys in the room who are accredited investors didn't know they were accredited investors, and they work for JP Morgan Chase, sitting across from the wealth manager for JP Morgan Chase. So the point is, it all goes down to what we said earlier: exposure, access, and education, which is why we're really harping on making sure that, again, we all can't be entrepreneurs, and if you are one, fantastic, but even entrepreneurs could be investors because they're actually typically the first investors in their own business. So we have to really focus on playing our role in like Samaria said earlier, investing in our entrepreneurs. I think there's some more questions.
Yeah, fantastic.
And we have time for at least one more question.
Great. Right here.
It's right here. This.
Oh. 2 more questions.
And that's all of our stories, right? Like, that's the story. Like, so that's what we find inside of the Black and brown communities. Like, so we're not anomalies, just one that just happened to be special. Like, this is really the case with all of us, right? And so it's just when somebody decides to finally peel back the onion, you're like, oh my God, look at that. All of this success, all of this value. But a lot of the other communities simply don't have close proximity to us, so they don't know that. So if you're from the community, like us hearing that, we're like, yeah, of course you did, right? Like, it's easy for us to see how you got there because we know what the resilience looks like, what the passion looks like, and the reason why you were doing it. But for everybody else, it just tends to come to them as a surprise. But for those of us that get it, we really get it, and that's why we have to stick together and support one another. We have to have conversations teaching people, you know, if you got $250,000 worth of net worth, you're an accredited investor. But even if they have the money, they still have to get access to the deal. They still have to know somebody at the bank that would be willing to tear off a few shares to even give it to them. So that's the main reason why people don't know that they're accredited investors, because even if they do find that out, they still have to find somebody like you that would be willing to even give them access to the deal flow.
That's another.
Right back in the back of the room. Yep.
Thank you. My name is TJ Campbell. My business is GYI Services. I'm out of California. I think of mobility when you guys talk about exposure, access, and education. I believe that's what I do with families and businesses every single day. My question to you guys are, when you guys create new initiatives and new programs, they're great at the C-suite and at the top at the executive level. But when you actually see day-to-day workers in your institutions, your brick and mortars, that information doesn't trickle down, and it actually makes it difficult for people who I consider myself an entrepreneur innovator to walk in that door and have this communication with them so they can see the value of what I bring to the table locally in those communities. I'd like for you guys to speak to your particular institutions and how that's being addressed.
Lost the microphone. So first off, I would say that your message about how it needs to cascade from the top all the way down through to the grassroots, through the front line, is entirely valid. And actually, through the work that we do on behalf of Wells Fargo and the Banking Inclusion Initiative, we're working to bridge that. And in part, thanks to Operation Hope having its coaches in our branches to do that financial education, to spend the time with folks about what are the ingredients to improve one's credit score, setting up a budget, developing healthy habits of automatic transfers, or whatever it is essential. And so thanks to Hope Inside, we're able to bridge that. I'd also say that, you know, within our branches, part of the reason why I love my job is because we get to do this work at scale. So when we're able to use our branch network to be able to deploy the service, but then also You know, with all of our branches, this is how we show up in our communities. And so, also as part of the work that we're doing, we're refurbishing our branches across the network. We're refurbishing our branches in diverse LMI communities, low and moderate income communities. And so all of that is impactful, we would like to think, towards helping to serve our communities.
Maybe I could also add by saying, you're absolutely right that the way companies walk in the world externally needs to be the way that they walk internally with their employees. So values held are values held for everyone, not just for any specific audience. So I mentioned, or any specific stakeholder group. I mentioned our $530 million initiative to racial equity and social justice. We've been on a long-term commitment over the past 5 years to also shore up the employee financial wellness of all of the people who work at PayPal. About half of our company works in a call center environment, and we found about 5 years ago or so that about 60% of those employees were finding it hard to make ends meet between paydays. So for us as a company that has written into our mission and vision a commitment to financial health and expanding economic opportunity, that was unacceptable. Last year, we achieved our long-term goals, but that's just a point to say, you have to, if you're gonna commit to this work in one place across the institution, it has to be deeply held in every other place across the organization. And it can't just be a CEO commitment, it has to be a cultural commitment on behalf of the company. And I'm happy to talk more about that with anyone, but I wanna use that as a pivot point to ask my last question, which is for everyone here on the panel to just share one piece of advice that you have for the group today as we all continue to advance this work when we leave this room and when we leave Atlanta, if we leave Atlanta.
My advice would just be continue to bet on yourself. Never underestimate what you and the immediate people around you have the ability to get done. Help is not on the way. Save yourself.
I would say, again, I love this forum, but you are around so many smart and blessed people. Build a connection. Talk to somebody who's right next to you at some point, and build those connections and networks, because it is through those connections and networks, one, you're telling the story, but then you're also making possibly new opportunities, identifying new opportunities, build your own networks.
Thank you all again for joining us for this discussion. I would say make sure you make a decision to take an affirmative step. I'll close with sharing this quick story. I'm a lawyer. When I was in law school, I remember I was sitting in property class, and the class was talking about equity. And I realized I didn't know what they were talking about because they were talking about equity in a different context. I grew up in the South Bronx, and I did not grow up in a house. So I didn't know equity from a financial perspective. I knew it in the context of fairness. So I had a Twilight Zone moment when I'm watching my classmates talking about something that I had no concept of, even though we were using the same word. I'm sharing that story because we all have an experience in life where we go from being unconsciously incompetent to being consciously incompetent. In other words, you get to the point where you realize, all right, now I know I don't know something. So the next step is to, now that I know I don't know, now it's incumbent upon me to take the affirmative step to learn, right? And so our charge at Urban Capital Network and the Innovation Center for Urban Entrepreneurship is to make sure that we play a role in participating and being part of the investor class, because as Tamara said, we all can give. You don't have to make $250,000 a year. You can give to an entrepreneur in your community. And so we do educational programming. So if you're interested in getting more information, you go to urbancapitalnetwork.com. You start getting a whole bunch of information. And if you have questions, you can reach out to any one of us. Two of my colleagues are here, Lenny Cezanne and Dr. Eric Tate. who's also from New York, can give you more insight and information. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all. Really, really appreciate this conversation and wish we could go longer. I hope all of you have a great rest of the conference, and hopefully you'll find us afterwards to continue the conversation.